Good morning and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and joining us in the studio today is Amy Callaghan, and joining us by Skype is Michael Russell MSP, the Cabinet Secretary with the unfortunate responsibility for dealing with Brexit. And of course Brexit is our top story today, as it seems to be virtually all the time these days. After last night's fascinating experience in the House of Commons where the Withdrawal Act that Boris Johnson presented was not passed after the so-called Letwin Amendment was passed, which was essentially to give the Parliament more time to consider the detail of this withdrawal deal. As a result, Boris Johnson was forced to send a letter to the Brussels asking for a further extension to the process, but with that letter he refused to sign it, and also sent another letter saying why he felt that a further delay would be a very bad idea. He warned of the corrosive impact of a long delay, saying that a further extension would damage the interests of the UK and our EU partners and the relationship between us. So, we are now in a position where there is no deal passed, there is no extension agreed yet, but it does look as though the EU is likely to agree some sort of delay, even despite Boris asking them not to, while asking them to. It is, I get this, a very confusing set of affairs. So, Michael, first of all to you. What do you make of last night's votes, and what do you think will happen now as a result?
It's a complete farce, and it looks farcical to the outside. Interestingly, the only corrosive effect a delay would be on the Tory party, and Boris Johnson knows that. The longer this goes on, the more damage is done to the Tory party. You see from the polls today, any indication that he would get a deal will diminish the vote for the Brexit party and increase the vote for the Tory party, though they're virtually the same these days. I suppose there's a number of scenarios that can now play out. A very short delay or a delay only to allow the House of Commons to pass the bill with scrutiny. That could take a week, 10 days, 2 weeks. A longer delay and possibly in the passage of the bill, the insertion of a referendum. But, I mean, we are at the stage where it is impossible to predict. It has been for some time. It's simply getting worse. What the problem is that now it would appear from all the evidence that the majority is now against Brexit. Certainly in Scotland it has been since the beginning, but it looks as if more widely the majority is against Brexit. So it's being done solely in the interests of trying to save Boris Johnson's skin and the Conservative Party for the future. Now, I don't care about saving either of those. What I care about is making sure that Scotland is treated properly, and we're being treated very badly indeed. Even in the deal, which is a dreadful deal, of course, Scotland is massively disadvantaged compared to Northern Ireland. And there is a basic inequity in the treatment of the two countries. So all in all, this is bad getting worse. What we have to do in Scotland is very clear about what we want. What we want is the right to choose in Scotland whether we stay with Brexit Britain or whether we become an independent country in the EU, and that's the campaigning that will continue.
And on that front, Michael, what is the Scottish Government's response here? I mean, I don't know, were you kind of kept in the loop on this as it was happening last night?
No, I mean, we see what we see. I spoke to Michael Gove on Thursday night. I can't say I learned a great deal from that experience, as I hardly ever do. There were a number of jibes at Scotland yesterday about what we might or might not do. But we have never been kept in the loop. There has been a pretense of trying to consult the devolved administrations where that really hasn't been happening. And if there was to be a deal, then of course the negotiations continue and become even more complex with the EU. And we've still not finalised how the devolved administrations might be involved in this. And quite the reverse, in fact. Welsh and ourselves have just completely rejected the current proposal from the UK about involvement in negotiations because it's gone backwards from what was being discussed even 3 months ago. So this is highly unsatisfactory. And the only way for Scotland is to choose independence. That's the only way that you can get out of this, because this is it's symptomatic of what the problems are. If if you wanted to understand what the difficulties are, you only had to watch the debate yesterday, a number of moments in it. Ian Blackford raising the issue of equity in terms of treatment of Scotland, and Johnson's immediate blustering response was to talk about an English rugby match. That was his first response. And then, most memorably, when Joanna Cherry rose to make a point of order at the end of yesterday's debate, all of the Tory benches rose and left the chamber in an act of calculated contempt. And this is what's happening all the time. Now, I don't believe that's the position of the ordinary people of England in any sense, but it is the position of the current UK government. And in those circumstances, we cannot live like that. We should not live like that. It is extremely damaging for us to do so. And therefore, we have to choose independence, and that's what we will do, I'm sure.
Okay, well, Amy, just to bring you in here, you are a prospective parliamentary candidate in East Bartonshire. So, what you were telling me just before we went on air that you've been out on the doors quite a bit recently. So, what kind of response are you getting from the ordinary people in East Bartonshire about this kind of thing?
So, really interestingly, yesterday we decided to go around the doors to have a chat with voters in East Bartonshire instead of sitting at home and watching TV. But what we found was that almost every single door we went to, the people of East Bartonshire were watching what was going on TV and watching this vote and just in complete dismay at what was going on down south. I think it just shows how archaic and how undemocratic this system is. I think yesterday was a prime example of that. And people are just so disillusioned and so just disenfranchised by it. They don't understand why this is actually happening. I think it's really clear to see that people just don't understand what's happening just now with Brexit, and what we are seeing in East Bartonshire is people want a chance to vote for change. They want a party that's going to stand up for them and stand up for an independent Scotland within Europe. They want a party that isn't going to flip-flop in their position the way the Lib Dems have constantly over Brexit. The SNP have been really clear on what our position is. Whereas the Lib Dems supported a referendum in the first place, and then they've changed their mind on their stance on that to begin with. But I think it's all about standing up for the everyday voter, people who don't understand exactly what the situation is, and doing our best for them to make sure that they're supported and stood up for and that their rights are protected.
Now, you mentioned the Lib Dems there, and as we've heard from both Jo Swinson herself and from other members of the Lib Dems, that they're completely unwilling to work with Jeremy Corbyn as a potential even caretaker Prime Minister while we figure out some way out of this situation. Do you get the feeling that that message has got through to people? Do you think people realise that perhaps the Lib Dems aren't as strongly anti-Brexit as they claim?
I think it's quite interesting because the Lib Dems do hail themselves as the saviours of Brexit and that they're going to see us through this, and that's not the case at all. What we've been hearing on the doors is people saying, I definitely won't vote Tory because of the mess that Brexit is, but they're not actually putting two and two together, that Jo Swinson and the Lib Dems would actually rather work with any party other than, they would work with the Tories, but they wouldn't work with any other party. They would not work with the opposition to get Boris Johnson out of number 10. I think it's really clear that the Lib Dems would actually quite happily get back into power with the Tories. Jo Swinson has never ruled that out as the new leader of the Liberal Democrats, and I think that's something we need to make very, very clear to people throughout Scotland, not just in East Bartonshire. There's obviously a few seats in Scotland that the Lib Dems target, and I think it's really important that we're getting that message out there that a vote for the Lib Dems is essentially a vote for the Conservative Party, and that's a vote for more. Less rights for people and potentially a more harsh Brexit.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, what sense are you getting from the other parties of any cooperation on this? We've heard obviously for quite some time that there have been various negotiations around a potential coalition, a no confidence vote, all these kind of issues. Where are we with negotiations with the other parties to try and do something about this now?
Well, I think the work with the Labour Party has been successful. I think the work with Plaid Cymru and the Greens has been successful. The blockage in this has been the Liberal Democrats. I'm a member for a former Liberal Democrat seat, which was their number one target, I seem to remember, in 2011, and they came fourth. The Liberal Democrats cannot be trusted on any of this, alas. And if they had been able to work well with the other parties, then we would not be in the mess that we're in. So I think we have to be very cautious. But that having been said, we want to stop this. We want to stop it either in its tracks on Monday or Tuesday in the House of Commons. That will be difficult to do. We want then, if it does pass with Tory votes and votes from some Labour members, we've got to remember there were Labour members that voted against the Letwin Amendment yesterday. So it is some Labour members that may allow Brexit to happen. Then we have to make sure that the bill going through is, for example, has a referendum in it. But at the end of the day, and this is the important thing, and this is the message on the doorsteps, at the end of the day, that the Liberal Democrats can't save Scotland, Labour can't save Scotland. The only thing that can save Scotland and put it on a normal path is independence. And it is the SNP that is offering that and has a route to independence through a legal referendum, which then leads to an application to join the EU. That is a straight line that lies in front of us. Everything else from the other parties is convoluted and not going to be successful.
And speaking of that route to an independence referendum, is there any sort of timescale in place now? We were at conference last weekend, and we heard the First Minister say that she intended to request the Section 30 order very soon. Has that been brought forward at all by what happened this weekend?
I think it's very clear. I think it's very clear where we are. We have always said, and the First Minister has always said, that this is driven not by us, but driven by what is happening with Brexit. And that has been the most incredibly complex, unpredictable, difficult set of things over the last 3.5 years. So it's been impossible to say, well, we're doing this next Tuesday and we'll do that next Thursday. That's not how things have gone. And we saw that yesterday, where expectations were overthrown in a matter of hours. But it's very clear. The First Minister said we will apply for a Section 30 order in a matter of weeks. That is because the referendum bill is presently going through the Scottish Parliament, and indeed I think we're likely to have the Stage 1 debate on that in early November. That bill will be through by the end of the year. That's what we will do. The arguments for Section 30 order are growing by the day. Yesterday was another illustration, but so are the people who say that this should be granted. For example, we know that Corbyn has said that just last week. The Welsh Government published a paper on the Constitution which said the union had to be voluntary, and that if a country wished to leave, it had to have the way to do so. So there is a growing acceptance that this has to happen. You have to have a legal referendum. If you don't have a legal referendum, then that is not recognised. But the campaign is growing, the feeling is growing, the arguments are growing, the evidence is growing. We have been here before. Scotland has been in this position before where people have shaken their heads and said, oh, nothing can be done. And then over a period of time, it happens, and that's exactly where we are now. And it's important that we keep our nerve, we keep arguing, we keep putting things in place, and that Section 30 order, as the First Minister said, will be requested, and the intention will be to have a referendum next year. That is the intention of the government, that is what we are working towards, and I think we should all campaign for that. Now,
we've heard that because this deal was only agreed with the EU 27 a couple of days ago, there's been very little time to analyse it. The British government has produced no economic analysis for this. Has there been any work happening in the Scottish government to try and figure out what this new deal Boris Johnson has presented would mean for Scotland?
Well, there's a great deal of evidence building up at the present moment. On the UK side, The Economist has run the numbers and said it's even worse than Theresa May's deal and has indicated the damage that would be done to individuals. We ourselves, of course, are working on it. I thought Steve Barclay's response yesterday to this point, to say that anything could happen, essentially, and therefore they weren't going to estimate it, was just nonsensical. But we can look at the main elements of this deal and the way... That's my phone. I shall stop that. I hope you like the tune anyway. That's what you're down now. We've seen on the main elements of the deal that have changed and changed substantially where the damage lies, and particularly in terms of the relationship that we would have compared to Northern Ireland. And that is a huge difficulty. There will be a customs border in the Irish Sea, so immediately there are issues for Stranraer and for Cairn Lyon and how that would be handled. But then, of course, there are the issues of advantage in commerce. I mean, it will be essentially part of the single market and associated with the customs union and the tax zone, the VAT zone for the EU. So there'll be major advantages there, which will not be available to Scotland. We know that coming out of the single market is damaging to Scotland. We've run those figures, we've published those figures before. All those things are in the mix, but there are also some unpredictable consequences which are just emerging. For example, the deal mentions fisheries and aquaculture. That was excluded from the previous deal. It's now in this deal. So it is conceivable that fishing boats could register in Northern Ireland and sell their produce in Northern Ireland and therefore take advantage of access to the European market in a way they couldn't in Scotland. And that is a major problem. I mean, in this constituency, in Argyll and Bute, where I'm sitting now, that would be a huge problem, because Northern Ireland is not very far away. Between the bottom end of the Mull of Kintyre and the North Antrim coast, it's only 12 miles. So you could have major unexpected consequences to be damaging. It's also true in agriculture. It's probably going to be true in a lot of other areas. So in addition to the basic democratic equity, that is, why should we not exercise democratic consent if it's being allowed in other parts of these islands? And there is the economic and social damage, which will be major.
Yeah, I actually have a story in front of me here from this weekend about supplies of salmon to a Japanese sushi chain that have gone up by 25% in the last year. Of course, you'll know that Europe and Japan have just recently signed a trade deal which has helped us access that market. But now, of course, that's going to be under threat from Brexit, along with all the enormous amount of seafood that's sold in Europe. On that front,
if there is, this is a really important point, particularly if the intention of Boris Johnson is to leave essentially the period of transition, which is expected to last until the end of 2020, but actually it would take far longer to negotiate a sensible trade deal. But if the intention is essentially to leave without the type of agreement that most people want to have, then that type of thing just falls away completely. Now, of course, we've heard in the last few days, and we heard from some of the extreme Brexiteers, that they've been reassured by Michael Gove and Dominic Raab that was the intention. That essentially, once they had got shot of Northern Ireland, which this deal would do for them, then they could concentrate on ensuring that they didn't get a type of deal that would be beneficial for everybody, but that hard deal which they want. And that's what would happen at the end of 2020. That is why any MP voting for this is voting for a pig in a poke. And for Labour MPs to vote for it on the basis that they have assurances on workers' rights is nonsensical, because those will be the first thing that will be jettisoned. You have a group of politicians who have spent their political lives arguing against the type of workers' rights and human rights and environmental rights that Europe has brought in. Do we really expect them to be vociferous in defence of those things when there is no obligation to do so? That's simply not going to happen.
And Michael, why is it? I mean, this is one of the things that I keep asking myself, and that other people keep asking me, because they think that I know something about politics. But why is it that these hard Brexiteers, why do they want to tear up all these good trade deals that we have via the EU in order to start from scratch with, and we don't have a negotiating infrastructure in the UK at the moment. I mean, it would be very, very difficult to replicate any of these deals that we have now. So what do you think the goal really is?
Money, profit for individuals, to drive down employment standards, to drive down environmental standards, no matter what they say. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't believe a word of reassurance on this. To drive those things down, to create essentially an unregulated economy as much as possible, which can race to the bottom. And there's lots of money to be made out of that for the type of entrepreneur who gather around the Tories at the present moment, and it will be paid for by the rest of us. There's also mixed up with that, because I actually think that will be very difficult for them and in the end damaging for them, although they could do it. But it's tied up with that is a sentiment about a past that never existed. There is this ludicrous sentiment about essentially the empire and how it can be recreated. Empire 2 will be there, and they will be able to do all these deals, and they will become the buccaneers of the 17th and 18th century, going out there and making deals, and it simply won't happen. And we will all be the poorer as a result of a fantasy and as a result of greed.
Yeah, and Amy, now in London yesterday, we saw what looked like an enormous protest. The report saying around 1 million people gathered, and this was to effectively demand a second referendum. Now, Mike has spoken about that a wee bit. What do you think that the impact is of that kind of march? Do you think it resonates with the government at all?
I think it would be nice if it did. I don't think it does. No, I think it's really, really good that people are getting out and standing up for what they believe in, and it's our democratic right to do things like this, and I think it's fantastic. The constituency that I'm hoping to represent voted 71% to remain, which is even higher than the average in Scotland. And I think it's really, really important that people are listened to, and I think the Scottish Government does a really, really good job in listening to people and listening to their views. And if something like this was to happen in Scotland, and the Scottish Government had the power to act on it, we would do so. But unfortunately, I don't think marches like this resonate with Boris Johnson, because he's just, or any of his government, in fact, because I think they're just interested in getting Brexit done, as we've heard him say several times.
Mike, what's your feeling on that? Do you think the movement of people on this issue is going to affect how the government deals with it?
Well, I think it's a factor, and I don't think it's a factor that can be ignored. I think that worldwide, the sight of very large numbers of people protesting against the government registers and protesting in favour of something. That's why marching for independence is also a good idea, because you show what you're in favour of and you mobilise people. That's the other issue. I think people get mobilised. They understand what they're up against and they want to do something about it. So I'm absolutely not against that, but also people have to then convert that appearance at the march into action, into votes, into campaigning for things. It's not enough just to go on a bus somewhere and say that was great, let's go back and go home again. You've got to be active. You've got to be active in the conventional political sphere. You've got to be persuading people to change their votes and to vote for something new. And in the case of independence, that means persuading people to vote for independence. And there are an awful lot of people who, and I meet them every day virtually, who voted no in 2014, who have changed their mind, sometimes with a heavy heart. Sometimes people who absolutely believe that Britain was the right thing, but who then look at it now and say, that's gone, that's over, it's being destroyed. We can do better than this.
And as you say, we had the big march in Edinburgh, which by some reports would be proportionally bigger than this march in London. Depends on exactly what numbers you choose to believe, but if it was as many as 200,000, which some have said, then that would be proportionately bigger than 1 million people marching in London. So what impact do you think those do have? Do you think anyone in Whitehall is paying any attention to these marches that we're having up here?
Cumulatively, there is a growing realisation, and I know this in the UK government, that the position that they hold cannot hold forever. Because there is a strong and growing support for a second independence referendum in Scotland. That this is not something that can be thrown out. Interestingly, Dominic Raab tried a line yesterday, which clearly they're constantly looking for the line that they think will be fatal to the Scottish cause. There isn't such a line. But he had a line yesterday about saying that, of course, what a vote for their deal would do would be honour the outcome of 2 referenda in Scotland. In other words, it would honour the outcome of the first independence referendum staying in the UK, and it would honour the outcome of the UK-wide second referendum. He was wrong, because in actual fact, in the independence referendum, insofar as you can draw other assumptions other than the final result, people were strongly influenced by the European argument. So you could take a line to say that what the first independence referendum did was also declare that people wanted to stay in the EU. Remember the argument? If you vote yes, then you won't be in the EU. And they confirmed that in the second referendum by saying they wanted to vote in the EU. So if you could to stay in the EU. So you could look at this and say that is a constant theme. Staying in the European Union, being part of the European Union as a small country in Europe is the constant request and demand of the Scottish people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we noticed, we were broadcasting from that march, and one of the things we noticed was how many of our new Scots, our EU friends, were there, and really very concerned about independence and the need for independence in order to protect their rights, their ability to stay in Scotland. And just before we let you go, Michael, what is the Scottish Government doing just now to protect the rights of EU citizens in Scotland?
This has been a very active issue, and I mean, quite clearly, the Scottish Government cannot grant citizenship to anybody living in Scotland because we are not yet an independent country. We can say that when we are an independent country, then that will be automatic, and we're not full up. And European citizens will not only be welcome here, they will have the rights they have now. And indeed, they can become Scottish citizens if they wish to do so. We published a very open and I think a coherent policy in that in 2014. But at the present moment, what we can do is provide help and advice. We can give the best help and advice that we can possibly give. And that's what we try to do. We've set up, we're working with the Citizens Advice Scotland, we've set up a phone line. There are people who can be consulted. There is information available. Many MSPs, including myself, have held special events for EU nationals. We've tried to provide individual tailored advice. Now, sometimes that advice isn't taken, because our advice is you should apply for settled status, regrettably, and nobody approves of it, and I think it's dreadful that people have to do it. But given where the law is now, people should apply for that. And if people don't apply for that, well, I understand it, but they are, in actual fact, not taking what I think is the best advice. And that also applies to people in other circumstances where individuals, for example, are dependent upon benefits from other European countries. We have given what we think is good advice, and indeed, it has turned out to be the correct advice, but people are entitled not to take it. They're absolutely entitled to do their own thing and to go their own way. But we can give help and advice, we can give support, we can show solidarity. You can't convert that into residency, but people have told me how much they appreciate that. And we can also say that with independence, and we want them to help us campaign for independence, with independence, those full rights will be guaranteed. Now, are there more things to do? I constantly talk to my colleagues, to Benn McPherson, who's the minister responsible for this, and to Fiona Hislop, about extra things we could do, and we're always looking for extra things to do. But what we can't do is actually grant citizenship, because we do not have the right to do so. There's no legal effect of that. And if you think about it, if we were to say to people, here, have Scottish citizenship, and it turned out that it meant nothing, then that would devalue that help that we're giving and would not help those individuals. So as much as we can do, we will do. If there is more to be done, we will do more. And I'm always open to that, talking to individuals and to groups and to people representing others. And we will work very hard to get independence so that we can then guarantee the future for all of us.
Well, Michael Russell, I know we don't have you for the full hour. I know we do have to let you go now. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm quite sure this will be a very busy week for you. So do try to stay sane for it.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Can I just quickly pick up on a point that Mike spoke
yes,
about
certainly.
there? So just in terms of the Scottish Government's position on European citizens, talking to people in Eastern Bartonshire, it's definitely coming across that they would be welcome in Scotland, and speaking to a few of them who couldn't vote in the referendum in 2014, they would definitely vote yes now, because the SNP and the Scottish Government are giving EU citizens the only alternative. We're giving them the only option to be an independent country within the European family of nations. And I think that's really, really resonating with people. Spoke to loads of them across Eastern Bartonshire, and it's definitely coming across. And whilst obviously they're scared and nervous and concerned about the situation that's going on just now, I think they do, and they are hopeful as to what could come in the future from the SNP and from an independent Scotland.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that the data shows is that what the Scottish Government did by sending out that strong message of welcome has made a big difference. Not obviously to the reality of what they're having to deal with in terms of applying for settled status and everything, but for people just to know that the government is not openly hostile to them the way that the Westminster government has seemed to be.
It's simply just knowing that they're valued and welcome, and that their appreciations to society are valid and valued is that simple. we appreciate that as individuals and human beings. So of course, EU nationals feel the exact same way, and it's just really important to get that message across and to really connect with them on a human level, because so many, especially coming from the UK government, is so hostile and so inhumane, really, the way the messages that are coming across. So I think just making sure, and I think our First Minister does that so well, just connecting with them on a human level and making sure that they know that they're appreciated and valued is just fantastic.
Absolutely. So we will, as I say, have to move on from Brexit. I mean, we probably could talk at further length, but there are other stories to talk about. And when we talk about big crowds on the streets campaigning for some sort of democracy, we're looking at Catalonia right now. Catalonia's president, Quim Torra, has called for talks with the Spanish government after condemning the violence that has occurred at some of these protests recently. He said, "Violence has never been our flag," and he said that he wanted Spain's government to open a dialogue to find a democratic solution and a political and democratical way out of the crisis. This has been after 5 consecutive nights of fairly substantial protests. I mean, again, up to millions of people on the streets, particularly in Barcelona, but also in the towns round about. There have been these marches. There was an occupation of the airport. There's been a great deal of activity in Catalonia since the sentencing of 9 of the politicians involved in organising the referendum that happened 2 years ago. Most of them have been in prison ever since, many in virtual solitary confinement or very, very limited visiting, even from their own lawyers in some cases. This is a really, really messy situation now. The EU, as much as we've been talking for the last half hour about how much we want to stay in the EU, the EU has not been a great support here to the people of Catalonia, and the Spanish authorities seem to still think that a violent response is the best response. There have been rubber bullets used, tear gas, a water cannon that was purchased by the Spanish government in 1994 was deployed for the very first time ever, just in the last day or two. So what do you make of the situation in Catalonia just now?
I think it's obviously incredibly disappointing and just awful to see the news at the moment. What is quite heartening though is to see the amount of people that are going out and protesting this. It is an incredible protest for democracy and for human rights and for freedoms that Catalonians and people in Spain deserve, and they've got the right to have that, and they've got the right to protest. I think it is, or I know it's awful that these political prisoners have been jailed, and they have been jailed for so long now, and we know how much they've got much longer now that they've actually been sentenced. It's grave, and it's absolutely despicable that this is happening. But the violent nature of these protests it's went too far in terms of the Spanish government's intervention in them. People have the right to go out and protest. They have the right for these protests to be peaceful, and they've got the right to stand up for what they believe in. I think it's really just disappointing and disheartening to see the nature and how it's taken a turn for the worse, unfortunately. Yeah,
I mean we're seeing reports, and it becomes very difficult, obviously, to assess what is really happening from this distance, because we're getting secondhand reports, often coloured by what the Spanish government, the Spanish police are saying. There have been accusations of violence from the Catalonian protesters, although that would be a pretty big departure from their traditional way of doing things. But then, one person, happens to say something inappropriate to a cop, and that can be treated as provocation. Do you see any way out of this? I mean, I don't know how much of an expert you are on the Catalonian situation.
Not particularly, but I think it's really important to note that these are accusations of violence. Up until this point, it has been very, very peaceful protests from the Catalonians from day one. So I think it's important to note that these are accusations of violence. We know that there has been violence on the side of the Spanish police. We've seen lots of evidence of that, but yet to see any evidence of it on behalf of the Catalonians. I would just like to say that the Scottish people and the people within the SNP stand shoulder to shoulder and hand in hand with our friends in Catalonia. This situation is just awful, and right now I'm not seeing a very clear way out of it at this present time. I think really, given the sentences and given the nature of them and given that these are political prisoners, we should not be seeing the sentencing that happened, and I don't see it, unless those sentences are revoked, how we could actually, the Catalonians would see a way forward out of this. But hopefully it does remain a peaceful protest.
And we have actually heard that there have been a journalist arrested, a journalist from El País has been arrested while trying to cover this protest on Friday. And when journalists start getting arrested, that's usually a very bad sign for a democracy. So given that the EU has been so silent on this, we're in this country, we're trying to promote the EU, we're trying to say we're enthusiastic Europeans, but at the same time, how badly do we want to be part of an organisation that will be silent on political persecution that we're seeing from Spain?
I mean, Kenny, we've sat here and spoke about the EU and how much we want to be a member of it for the past half hour, and it's not a perfect, it's not perfect. We can definitely make some changes to the EU. We're not saying that remaining a member of the EU is going to remain the same way that it is. Alan Smith, MEP, has been in Brussels for years now, fighting to change some of the things that have been going on. I think we just need to maybe take example of what's happened in Catalonia and make sure that if we go forward into a Scottish referendum, that we make sure it's a legal and lawful referendum, and one hopefully that the EU would respect. It's terrible and incredibly awful what's happening in Catalonia just now, but I think we need to learn from it and make sure that it doesn't happen to us. But in terms of the EU's silence on it, I do think it's wrong. I think they should be commenting on it and at least maybe trying to help the Catalonians and act. But I guess that because we're not getting the proper accurate reporting, they're maybe feeling a bit that they don't have anything to go on at the moment, but I'm not sure. Hopefully we'll see something from them quite soon.
And when you talk about learning from Catalonia, now they are well known for having these enormous protests and marches on a regular basis. Now they do have the benefit of much better weather in Barcelona, which makes it a lot easier to get people out on the streets compared to the drizzle that we had at the march in Edinburgh. But what else can we learn from Catalonia about getting that big popular movement of people who are active in the cause, rather than and I'm not accusing many or even most or even many people in the independence movement of being in this boat, but of people who are just kind of passively pro-independence and aren't willing to get out and fight for it. How do you think we can encourage people to get more active? I
think Mike hit the nail on the head earlier, and it's great going to these rallies and it's great going to do all these different things and walking down the street hand in hand with your friends who also agree with you on these issues is fantastic, but it's all about going home and passing on these views to other people. If you're seeing, several 100,000 people in the street, which is nothing compared to Catalonia, if those 100,000 people then went home to their friends and their family and told them about the independence movement and told them about the benefit of Scotland being an independent country and told them about the kind of increased rights that we would have as an independent country and how our economy could grow and how we could build to be a far more prosperous nation, then I think we'd be in a far more beneficial position. I think if we could get millions of people out in the street, it would be fantastic. But right now the polls are becoming our friends. We're sitting at 50% support for independence. If we could build that up by more people coming to marches, but then going home and acting as well, by talking to people on the doorsteps, by talking to their friends, by talking to their neighbours, by talking to their colleagues. There's so much that could be done there to increase this independence movement. I'm hoping to represent a constituency that didn't vote yes in 2014, but what we're hearing on the doors all the time is people realising that independence is the best thing for Scotland. We're talking to people who are seeing that it would only benefit their children in the future, that it would benefit them in the future as well, that really the only way forward for Scotland to remain within Europe is to be an independent country.
Mm-hmm. Just on that note, something I've wondered about before, and I've asked a couple of other guests about this, but when you think about independence for Scotland, does it worry you at all that we may now achieve independence as a reaction against Brexit rather than as it would have been in 2014 as a vision of something better. Do you think maybe that feeling of people turning, because as Mike said, of people turning with a heavy heart towards independence?
Yeah.
Do you think that colours what the movement looks like?
I've probably never really thought of it that way, but I've never been part of a more positive movement than the independence movement, whether it be in 2014 or whether it be now, whether it be reactive or proactive. I don't think it really particularly matters, to be honest with you. All I'm hearing is, regardless of people saying with a heavy heart, it's a heavy heart with a positive view for the future. I don't think that's a particularly negative stance. I've spoken to obviously many people within the independence movement, and many people, who are independent supporters, but maybe who wouldn't, be part of the actual movement. And I think we're all united in thinking that it's something that's better, regardless of whether you figured that out 20 years ago or 20 minutes ago. I think we're all united in knowing that it's for a better Scotland and a better future for ourselves and for our children and for our grandchildren. Regardless of the heavy-heartedness of it, I think it's probably still a positive in my eyes anyway.
Okay. And as you look at the situation in Catalonia, what would you like to see the Scottish government and the Westminster government doing in relation to Catalonia?
I think, condemning the violence is the most important thing. No political protest like that should be violent in its nature. I think it started off as a peaceful protest and should remain one. I believe the Catalonians have been protesting peacefully, and I'm yet to see anything different. But the Scottish government has stood strong alongside Catalonia from day one, and I think that will continue. I'm not particularly sure how the UK government could intervene on this and how they could help matters at all. Obviously, they've never been particularly supportive of Catalonia and their independence movement, so I don't see that being supportive at all. But I think knowing that the Scottish government are there and supportive is probably a useful tool for the Catalonians.
Yeah. Well, we certainly do hope that there is some resolution to that issue. I don't know when or how that will be achieved, but we certainly hope that there can be a peaceful, democratic outcome, because that's the only way we can really move forward. And speaking of protests and some degree of state violence, there have been further protests in Hong Kong, including a march today that was declared illegal by the police. They'd announced that there wouldn't be authorization given for a protest today. But people were marching with banners reading "Free Hong Kong, Hong Kongers resist," and graffiti saying "Better dead than red." Police, as I said, have declared the march illegal, meaning that protesters face arrest just for being there. They don't necessarily have to do anything. This is a movement that has been largely led by young people, but there are some elderly people out there as well. Now, this has erupted into some degree of violence. There have been attacks on metro stations, like fires set and various other things. Quite a bit of graffiti, running battles with the police, who admittedly have also acted somewhat wildly. We saw footage the other week of a student who was shot by a cop who ran into the crowd with his gun drawn, which frankly can't be considered normal.
Yes.
So what do we make of this situation in Hong Kong? This has been going on for several weeks now. It started with this protest over the extradition bill, which would allow people from Hong Kong to be extradited to the Chinese mainland to face trial in their courts, which are, let's say, not the most transparent or just. So what do you make of the situation in Hong Kong just now?
I think it's awful. I think the levels of violence that it's reached is quite abhorrent, to be honest with you. Although it started off as a sound reasoning for protests, and it's now turned into something quite the opposite. I think it's really quite telling, though, that we've seen so many protests and so many young people especially hitting the streets all across the world, standing up for better human rights and further democracy. I think that's incredibly important, but I think the message has somewhat been lost here a bit. I hope that things can turn around and change, and that we can see a a more peaceful end to this protest. But, the reasons were sound. The people of Hong Kong should not be getting extradited to mainland China for trial, regardless of the situation. I think that's clear.
We have a quote here from Chung, a 33-year-old woman. She said, "You can't ask a city that already has freedom to walk backwards. You can't do this to an international city." And then another one, Jack, a student, saying, "China can use its influence to erode human rights and values around the world. The protests are not just for Hong Kong, they're for human rights and values globally." And as China kind of grows its international influence, I mean, China over the last decade or two has vastly expanded its economic power. It's now got huge influence across Africa. It's having growing influence across its neighbours in Asia. It owns a vast amount of American and British sovereign debt, which gives it an enormous amount of leverage. And when we see this kind of repression and the kind of lack of human rights that exists in China, does it worry you at all that China may kind of spread its way of doing things around the world, or do you think that the democratic powers of the world still have enough power to resist that?
I would like to think that the democratic powers of the world still have the ability to resist that, but we don't want to see people anywhere being oppressed. We would like to see human rights. I would like to see human rights, being extended as opposed to, quashed. The people of Hong Kong have enjoyed more increased human rights than the people in mainland China for some time since they became out with the British colony. So that should be continued, and you can't have human rights and then have them, slowly taken away from you. We don't want to see that. We want to be standing up to make sure these people keep the human rights that they have and that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. These protesters, they have 5 key demands: universal suffrage, an independent inquiry into the police actions against these protesters, amnesty for the people who have been charged, an end to describing protesters as rioters, and finally the formal withdrawal of the extradition bill. Carrie Lam, who is the governor of Hong Kong, has said that the bill is dead. It won't be going forward, but it hasn't actually yet been formally withdrawn. And on today, she said a police complaints inquiry will be completed before the end of the year. But we've heard from protesters saying there's no way this is going to be a fair report, and this is something that we've seen in Britain and probably every other country at some time, where there is a cover-up. The government does something bad, and then it reports on itself saying, no, everything's fine. Do you think there's any hope of Hong Kong having a some sort of independent inquiry into this, any sort of independent maybe intervention by peacemakers? Do you think that's possible?
I don't think that's an unreasonable ask, but given the state of the country at the moment, it maybe does seem unreasonable to the protesters. I mean, those 5 demands, all of them seem sensible and seem quite reasonable, in fact, for people living in Hong Kong. It's not as if they're asking for anything outrageous. They're asking to be known as protesters instead of rioters. It's the terminology used there is quite concerning, actually. And even just, universal suffrage, these kind of things, these are all a given to us in, a democratic society. But obviously that's not the nature of mainland China, and Hong Kong shouldn't be denied this just because mainland China is.
Yeah, it's a really remarkable situation. China, of course, historically this was meant to be one country, two systems. The idea that Hong Kong could still be a thriving capitalist metropolis, while the mainland was such a in theory communist, but in actual fact just a dictatorship. That's effectively what it is. It is no longer in any meaningful sense a communist country. So these protests do go on. There have been 2 people shot and wounded by police, thousands injured, 2,300 people arrested since the protests began in June. Do you see anything happening soon, or do you think this is probably something that is going to run and run?
I think it's quite hard to predict, especially coming from China's leadership. It is they are quite unpredictable. But obviously I would like to see an end to this very soon, especially in terms of the violence and, you know, the incident rates. Would like to see that dropping and finishing quite soon. I think, like I said earlier, I don't think it's unreasonable, these demands being met at all. They're fairly sensible and could actually be completed quite easily, I believe. So I would like to see an end to it very, very soon, but I think that's looking quite unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will keep an eye on that. And meanwhile, we turn our attention to the United States, where the White House appears to have acknowledged now that there were strings attached in Trump's withholding of aid to Ukraine. This is the issue over which this is the issue that prompted the Democrats to finally begin impeachment proceedings in the House of Representatives. So this was Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House Chief of Staff, acknowledged in a briefing with reporters that the US aid already approved by Congress was held up partly over Trump's concerns about a DNC computer server alleged to be in Ukraine. Mulvaney said, "I have news for everybody. Get over it. There is going to be political influence in foreign policy." Yes, obviously foreign policy is guided by politics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that foreign policy is conducted in order to benefit the president personally in his political campaigns. What do you make of all this that's been going on in the US? I don't know how closely you've been following it, but
I just think this is a prime example of what happens when you've got a conglomerate business manager head of state. I think our First Minister has played a blinder from day one in terms of just shutting Donald Trump down and shutting down the communications that the Scottish Government have with him, because Scotland wants better and Scotland does not want this kind of action, we condemn this action. State aid should not come with political ties. That's the be all and end all.
Yeah, it's very disturbing how this has happened, and how perhaps what's even worse is how open. And I can't tell if it's incompetence or if it's hubris.
Yeah.
But the Trump administration seems to be quite willing to admit that this has been happening. There was what do you make of that? What do you think which do you think it is? Do you think it is just that they don't realize what they're saying and don't care, or do you think it's that they're kind of thumbing their nose at the Democrats saying, because they know that it's highly unlikely Trump will actually be impeached by the Senate?
Potentially the latter, yeah. I think, I think from day one Trump's used distraction techniques. We speak about his Twitter and we see how these things are going on, and it's actually just so that people are talking about that and they're not actually seeing the actions that he's completing as president. I think it's quite telling that he's being so open about things like this. No other president would ever have done that. That in my memory anyway. If you'd like to think that if a president was talking so openly about there being political ties to state aid, that action would actually be taken against them. But it just seems completely unlikely. It just seems as if people are turning their nose to it because they're so used to this coming from him now.
Yeah, this comes after the US ambassador to the EU gave written testimony to the impeachment inquiry that Trump had told senior US officials to talk directly to his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, about US policy in Ukraine. So this is Gordon Sondland. He said that he and two other officials were disappointed in Trump's May order, but they followed it anyway. Sondland said he felt foreign policy should be the work of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer. It almost boggles the mind that has to be said, that a private citizen who has no role in government is the personal attorney of the president. Should effectively be directing foreign policy.
I think that again just highlights the difference in having a stereotypical businessman as your head of state. Instead of going to the State Department to go through these things and to negotiate state aid, he goes to his personal lawyer. That should not happen. Categorically should not happen. But I would very much doubt that it would even be properly investigated. Given a lot of these things have been happening before, and they've been happening since he's been president. And he's, yet to be impeached. So.
Yeah, Sondland, I should add, he did say he did not fully appreciate in late May what Giuliani's intentions were regarding Ukraine, which was apparently largely to investigate Hunter Biden, the son of Vice President Joe Biden, who is potentially running against Trump.
Yeah.
In the election next year, it does seem that a big part of all of this was Trump looking for dirt, which is the same thing that happened in 2016. He asked the Russians to help him get dirt on Hillary Clinton, now asking Ukraine to get him dirt on Joe Biden. It's a really dark situation. This is not something that we've really seen before in American politics. Again, it does seem unlikely that he's going to be impeached. Do you differ on that? Do you think it might happen?
No, I very much doubt that he would ever be impeached. But just to be very, very clear, state aid should never be used for personal or political gain, ever. I would never support anyone that done so. And I think it's incredibly telling that America has a president that would do that. And hopefully we'll see a change at the next election. Yeah.
Well, we will look forward to that. We will keep up with this story. I mean, we've topped and tailed the show with Brexit and with Trump, with these two stories that just seem so unbelievable.
Yeah.
And in your own constituency, just to bring it back to you for a wee bit, because a lot of our viewers won't really know much about you. We have, of course, seen the super anti-Brexit Lib Dems refusing to work with other parties in order to prevent Brexit. So you're running against Joe Swinson in any potential election that comes up. We don't know yet if or when an election is going to happen, but you are locked in for that role. So just tell us quickly how you got into politics and what your goal is in that seat.
So I left school in 2010 and I went on to study politics at university. I was quite fortunate to get an internship with the SNP straight from that. I then moved on to work for several SNP MSPs. Throughout my time at university I was quite unwell and I've been an activist for Teenage Cancer Trust and ever since then. So, I've worked really closely with young people who've been quite unwell as well, and I've also been a member of the children's panel. So I've seen firsthand the devastating impacts that policies that the Tory government, propped up by the Lib Dems down in Westminster have had on the people of East Dunbartonshire in particular. We're seeing children and families and young people who are suffering on a daily basis and, really awful increased use in food banks and struggling to get by and worrying each day how they're going to make ends meet. It's a really, really awful situation. And I genuinely think that, with that knowledge and with my youth on my side as well, I can tackle issues such as austerity and climate change, and the response I've been getting on the doors have been really, really positive in terms of that. These are the two key issues of, including Brexit as well, of the day, and what people that matter to people in East Dunbartonshire is climate change, is how we tackle austerity and get young people and children out of poverty. And I'm going to lead on that if I get elected down to Westminster.
Brilliant. Well, Amy Callaghan, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you also to Mike Russell for joining us earlier.
Thank you.
I would just like to remind you watching that producing TV programmes is an expensive business. We tell you this all the time, but we had 4 days at the SNP conference last weekend. We were told by numerous people there how impressive our setup is, and that's nice to hear, but it costs money to make it happen. And so we would invite you, if you can afford it, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Your £5 a month can make an enormous difference to what we're able to do here at Broadcasting Scotland. We want to be able to get to conferences and marches and other events. We want to be out there making as many stories as we can to bring to you here on the channel. So if you are able to support us at all, then do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter. In the meantime, thanks again to Amy, thanks again to Mike, and thanks again to you for joining us. We will be back all through the week with the Scotland at 7, and we'll be back next Sunday with the Full Scottish at the same time as usual. So thank you again for joining us. Goodbye.